of the term Anthropocene? Most people here. In that case, I hope most people also know what it means. But essentially, it means that we live in a new geological era in which human activity has become a dominant force, shaping the way the planet functions. And this is significant because the Earth is a complex integrated system. And for most of the period of modern human existence, all fluctuations and changes have been highly constrained. As you can see from this graph, which shows the carbon dioxide, methane, and temperature fluctuations over the last 400,000 years. And just plotted on there is also the time at which fully modern humans evolved in Africa, and then also in the very last period, the beginning of agriculture in the period known as the Holocene. And this is important that the Earth has been functioning in a very stable way because humanity depends on a wide range of what are called ecosystem services or benefits that humans derive from nature and from the way that the Earth currently functions. And these range from what are called provisioning services, such as, say, fish that we catch in the oceans, agriculture, food that we're producing, also regulating services, such as clean water that's regulated through a variety of vegetation and other processes, regulation of the climate through droughts and floods. There are also a range of cultural services, such as recreational services, but also important cultural events, such as this is the Sami Reindeer Festival in Sweden. And then there's a bunch of supporting ecosystem processes, such as photosynthesis and I think the wide range of biodiversity on the planet that supports many of the things we depend on. And this is both in poorer societies, but also for modern industrial societies and people living in cities. And the important thing is that in the Anthropocene, human activity is now changing some of the basic dynamics and the way that the Earth is functioning. And this is especially in this very recent period. We see that many of these parameters that have been highly constrained are now going off the charts. And this is likely to have, and is already having, direct impacts on a wide range of ecosystem services that we depend on. And many of these impacts have especially increased since the 1950s during the period that is known as the Great Acceleration. And we see this in a wide variety of socio-economic trends, from population to economic growth, energy use, urbanization, communication, etc. As well as in a wide variety of Earth system trends. The rise in carbon dioxide levels is well known, but we also see the rise in many other atmospheric gases, stratospheric ozone levels. We also see the rise in marine fish capture, loss of tropical forests, etc. All have these what are known as hockey stick curves since the 1950s. And importantly, these changes are also increasing the risk of crossing tipping points at a variety of scales. And many people may have also heard of this notion of tipping points, but it's one of the key areas that I work on. And when you cross these tipping points, it leads to a phenomenon known as regime shifts, which are large persistent changes in the structure and function of a system. And they can be, I think, well understood by this metaphor of the cup and ball, and thinking that you may be in one regime or way that the system is working that is constrained by a variety of feedback processes, but if those are weakened or changed, you can then tip over into a completely different regime where the system works in a completely different way and produces a different set of ecosystem services, conditions and benefits to people. There are many examples that are already well documented of these types of regime shifts. One well-known example is the shift from these diverse coral reefs to algae-dominated reefs, which have much fewer or much lower levels of biodiversity. And this also then has direct impacts for instance, ecotourism, or also for subsistence fisheries for people that depend on the reef ecosystems. Another example, more relevant here in Africa, is that it's also been shown that we can have shifts from forests or these closed canopy forests into open savannas, which again also has large impacts on the kinds of livelihoods that people can practice in these systems. So why these regime shifts matter is that they're these non-linear phenomena, so they often come as a surprise and they're difficult to predict, so it's difficult to prepare for them. And once they happen, they're also very difficult or often impossible to reverse because of changed feedbacks in the system. And then, as I've mentioned, they tend to have very large impacts on ecosystem services and society. And also they appear to be increasing in frequency because of these large pressures on the Earth system associated with the Great Acceleration. So as I mentioned, one of the main pieces of work that I'm leading together with a colleague, Christy Masandruski, at the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, and together with colleagues in Sweden, is compiling this global evidence base of these regime shifts around the world. And this is available online, and then we record for all these different regime shifts based on the published literature, a whole variety of information on what are the causes of these shifts, how do they happen, where do they occur, under which kinds of conditions, at which kinds of scales, both spatial and temporal, what do we know about their reversibility, and what kinds of evidence do we have for these regime shifts. And then one of the, I think, most exciting analyses that we're busy working on at the moment, and this is again led by Christy, is looking at which regime shifts then are likely or could potentially occur in different parts of the world. So we've mapped these out, linked to the different biomes around the world, and then we've translated this into the potential impacts on the Sustainable Development Goals, and making the point that there are a large number of Sustainable Development Goals that could be compromised if we don't account for the possibility of these tipping points. So I think this background and this analysis about the SDGs specifically emphasizes the point that the Earth and human society have become deeply intertwined, and not just at a local scale, where people have, I think, in many ways depended on ecosystems for a very long time, but at a global scale. And I think a really important implication of this is that we can no longer think about ways of improving human well-being, and especially alleviating poverty, without recognizing and taking account of the interconnections between people and nature at these local to global scales. And the rest of my talk kind of goes more into this. And I think at a kind of a fundamental level, at the global scale, one of the key questions I think that many scientists are pondering is whether we're actually eroding the planetary conditions, in a sense, this tight fluctuation that we've seen for many hundreds of thousands of years in the time that modern societies have evolved. And are we actually eroding these conditions now with the kinds of impacts we're having on the planet? So as I said, we've definitely had variation, but this variation has actually been quite constrained for basically most of modern human existence. And I think the interesting thing is that specifically in this most recent geological period called the Holocene, we've actually had extremely stable conditions and also slightly warmer temperatures. And it's during this most recent period that we have actually agriculture developing in several places around the world simultaneously, and then we have the emergence of these large complex societies, much of which we have then built on in the modern industrial world. So sort of the background for this talk, and I think for much of the work we do, is that there's increasing evidence that we're actually now have, in terms of the way that the planet functions, we've moved out of the Holocene conditions, and in a sense this basin of attraction in the way that the planet functioned in the Holocene, and we're now moving up to some new condition since maybe before the Great Acceleration, but I think increasingly speedily exiting the Holocene. And we don't yet know where we're going. So I think this sets the context for this project on the seeds of the Good Anthropocene, but also more generally for a lot of the work that we're doing at the CST. So I think it's clear from that background why there are several centers around the world emerging looking at options for sustainability transitions. Because essentially the way I like to think about it is that the Anthropocene poses a very clear challenge to us, in the sense that the changes that we've made to the Earth, especially I think in the last 100 to 200 years, have really increased at least the material well-being for very many people, And that is especially the case if you consider that also human population has increased very dramatically over the last 100 to 200 years. And these changes we've made to the Earth have largely been to appropriate ecosystem services to support humanity. But there's accumulating evidence, such as I now presented, and I think many global assessments have been putting together this evidence that this trajectory that we're on is unsustainable, and that many of these ecosystem services that we depend on are now degrading and unlikely to meet future demands. And beyond just the changes in the Earth system conditions, we also have these massive inequalities, social inequalities. So that also the appropriation of these resources is being disproportionately going to the wealthy, and the poor generally are getting very little of these resources and are remaining poor. So to me, this really frames the challenge that we're facing, is in a sense that the method or the approach that we've used to alleviate poverty and increase human well-being, especially since the Industrial Revolution, it's not really possible to continue with that mechanism to reduce poverty and increase human well-being in the future. We need a different approach. And as I said, the other big question in terms of sort of the global planetary conditions is where on Earth we're going, since we have, and I think there's quite a lot of evidence now that we've changed the functioning of the planet at a global scale in a way that we've exited the conditions since basically the invention of agriculture and all of the development of more complex modern societies. And at the moment, the best guess is if we kind of continue on this trajectory, we're going to get to a much, much warmer Earth, and there will be significant impacts most likely in changing, for instance, just the basic kinds of agriculture that we can do, and the variability of the climate and how that affects many things. So I think increasingly now there's an interest in, maybe we can't really return to the Holocene given where we are, but how do we maybe ameliorate the conditions and this trajectory that we're on to get to something that we're kind of terming the Good Anthropocene. So it'll be something different from the past. It's not about going back to the past, but it's about creating a future that is also good. So I think now there's a lot of kind of deeper philosophical thinking about how should we go about achieving such a sustainability transition. And I think many of these ideas are floating about and being combined in interesting new ways. And this is, I think, a very nice summary that was put together by Rika Pricer, who's also at the CST, that kind of looked across the literature on the Anthropocene and responses to it, and identified sort of four major perspectives or ways in which people are thinking about the Anthropocene and how we should respond. So the first one is what's called the eco-modernist approach, that really builds on ideas from the Enlightenment. And the focus here in terms of how should we achieve a sustainability transition is really on technological innovation and trying to control some of, for instance, the geoengineering, trying to control the impacts of climate change. Another sort of big set of work, it maybe takes this perspective known as biosphere stewardship. I think this is also quite strong out of the work out of the Stockholm Resilience Center. The idea here is that humans are intertwined and dependent on the functioning of the Earth system, and that we need to think about being stewards of the Earth and reconnecting people to nature. And then another approach, I think largely being driven out of the STEP Center in the UK, is around thinking around different sustainability pathways. And the idea here is really to try to open up spaces for engaging different perspectives on how should we get to a more sustainable future. And then lastly, there's some ideas from critical post-humanism that also kind of tries to rethink the role of humans and thinks about the place of humans much more in terms of their relations with other organisms, living or non-living, in the biosphere. So kind of related to those four perspectives, and I think maybe more coming out of the work around the planetary stewardship, is also this idea of planetary boundaries, which I think is another interesting idea that's been put forward to try to think about how to deal with this challenge of the Anthropocene and sustainability transitions. And the idea of the planetary boundaries was really to try to think about what is the safe operating space for humanity. So in a sense, what are the basic conditions at the global scale that we need to maintain to have, and the key thing here is to maintain Holocene-like conditions on Earth. And with the idea that we know that our current societies can function in the conditions of the Holocene, and we've built up actually very large complex societies under these conditions. And it may be that we've now got the technology and innovation to actually be able to deal with a very different kind of world, but that's something we don't know. So in a sense of saying, maybe we shouldn't stray too far away from these Holocene-like conditions. So that's one piece of work that I was also involved in, the more recent paper on that. Linked to this, I think then people have also been thinking more about not just the Earth system dimensions, but also some of the social dimensions, and have put forward this idea of a safe and just operating space. So thinking not just about these environmental limits, but also what are some of the basic social conditions that we would want to meet, in a sense, to create a good Anthropocene, or what are these criteria for a good Anthropocene. So as I say, these are all ideas that are being put out there and are circulating around that we're trying to engage with and think through. I think maybe another dimension, or a third dimension, is that there's also been a big increased focus on ideas around resilience, and that's also very much the work that I'm engaged in. And I think this is also in response to these unknown and novel conditions and turbulent conditions that we're encountering in the current state of the Anthropocene. So resilience thinking is basically one emerging approach to sustainability that complements other approaches, but the real focus here is on building capacity to deal with change, and this is especially unexpected or novel change. So it's really focusing on building that capacity in systems. And also the definitions of resilience, especially social ecological resilience, I think are evolving quite fast, but some of the most recent definitions are around essentially resilience being a capacity of a system, and how do we build the capacity of these systems to sustain human well-being in the face of disturbance and change. And that's a lot of the work that I'm engaged in now, is also really focusing on these ideas. How do we build these capacities, and also how do we put these ideas into practice? So maybe just quickly also, I think resilience is a very multifaceted concept, and it can entail building the capacity to do three different things that at first glance sort of seem contradictory. But if you think about it being about the capacity to sustain human well-being, then I think that makes sense. So the first capacity is the capacity that I think many of us think about when we think of the term resilience, is the ability to persist or recover in the face of disturbance and change. And I think in that sense, many of the ecosystems that, and the impacts we're having on ecosystems, much of the focus here is really on recovery. So the impacts on, for instance, this is a beach full of plastics, and how do we, in a sense, have resilience and enable recovery from these quite severe impacts in cases. Then a second kind of aspect to resilience is the ability to adapt, and that is also the idea that we're not in stable conditions actually ever. I mean, society is always evolving and changing. So also, how do we adapt to some fundamental changes? And one of the main changes obviously happening around the planet at the moment is this massive urbanization around the planet. So also, how do we change the ways that we're producing food, bringing food to people, managing diseases? There are many things that are associated with the move from living actually in kind of smaller rural settlements and then shifting into these big cities. We need to do things a bit differently. And then thirdly, and this is where there's increasing focus now, is really on the capacity to innovate and transform, and to do things fundamentally in a different and new way, So essentially here you can also think in order to sustain human well-being, there may be a bunch of things that we're doing currently that we actually fundamentally need to change. It's not about tweaking them or adjusting them a little. We need to do it in a completely different way. And I think this is also where the ideas around sort of transformation are increasingly focused on these aspects. And so that over time, also in the resilience literature, we really see a shift from a focus on persistence and recovery down to innovation and transformation. And then maybe just the last point on ideas around resilience is this is also some work that I led that's come out in several different forms, but it's really also trying to then think about what are some of the underlying principles or ways in which you can foster this resilience or this capacity to deal with change and disturbance. And so based on a big literature review, at the moment we've come up with 7 broad principles, which I'm sure will also adapt and change over time. But it's around ideas such as that you need to maintain some level of diversity and redundancy in your system in order to have the capacity to deal with change. So I think you can also think of if you a small-scale farmer and you're planting certain crops, you may want to have a variety of crops to be able to deal with different diseases or shocks that may come along. But for each of these, we've kind of unpacked them and thought about how do they actually help provide this general capacity to deal with unexpected things that happen to you. So I think that all provides quite a lot of the conceptual thinking that's behind this, what I find, I think, one of the most exciting projects that I've been involved in the past few years, called the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes initiative. That's really taking a lot of these ideas and then trying to think about the future. So essentially the starting point for this project is that it's increasingly clear, as I've sketched, that the current trajectory of environmental and social change cannot be sustained. But at the moment we don't really have at all a sense of what an attractive and viable alternative is. And the result is that, in a sense, many people are just projecting, we're leaving the Holocene, we're going to some novel conditions, we don't know what's going to happen, and then very many dystopian stories about the future, what could happen to humanity. So, as a response, and this is really just like the initial small step, not a solution. The starting point for this initiative is really to try to explore and start developing more of a narrative around what, and not just a good Anthropocene, but what are some different options for good Anthropocenes. What could they be like? And in this project, we're particularly interested in capturing perspectives from sort of non-dominant groups and cultures. So obviously there's a lot of it's a big discourse around sustainability, and there's the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are many ideas, but we're also want, in a sense, to challenge some of those ideas and think at a more deeper level, what could a good and sustainable world be? And this initiative kind of has 2 main components, and probably in some ways more, but in terms of the ones I'm engaged in, there's a big global initiative through the new Future Earth platform, which is a big consortium for global change research. And this project was actually funded as one of the initial fast-track projects when Future Earth started. And then in addition to that, we've also obtained some separate funding in Southern Africa to kind of dig more deeply into these ideas, and especially then not just to run this kind of online campaign to think about the good Anthropocenes, but really engage in stakeholder dialogues. And let's take a sip of water. But one of the sort of premises behind this project is also around the power of stories. And I think this also comes out of some research, obviously at a completely different scale, but within organizations, where it's also sort of been found from, also in the psychological literature, how important it is to have sort of a positive vision of where you want to go, and not just sort of a scary picture of where you don't want to go, in order to garner kind of action and policy around that. So I think kind of a starting point for this project, and I'll just put both up while I take a sip of water, but it's essentially that, if the kinds of stories that we have about the future are these dystopian, really negative stories, then when turbulence, shocks, bad things happen to us, we interpreted those as the beginning of the end of the world. And we may not respond in a way that actually maybe helps us to get somewhere good. So in contrast, if we have stories that about a different future that is positive and can kind of garner attraction and interest, then they provide a different space for making sense also of things that happen in society. So there may be that in those stories that we have a period of turbulence before we get to an alternative future. So it's some of this thinking that is informing this work. And as I say, I mean, this is quite an out there project. It's like sort of based on traditional kind of modeling, hardcore simulation kind of approaches. It's taking really a much more narrative-based, exploratory approach, which I think has also been fun, but it's also quite challenging in a way. So then the other sort of main premise in this project is that meeting this Anthropocene challenge that I sketched earlier, I would say most likely it requires a change or a reorganization of the way that we live in the world that's maybe more similar to the shift that happened between how the world was working and how it was running and functioning, say from medieval times in Europe to the industrial times. It's a fundamentally different way in which society is organized, and then the way that it uses or depends on the earth and the kinds of impacts that we have. So essentially, we're proposing that such a sustainability transition would entail a fundamental shift in the underlying worldviews, assumptions, and values that shape individual choices and human societies. So then the question is, why focus on seeds, since we're calling the project the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes? And the rationale for this is that it's almost impossible to imagine such radically different futures. So, for instance, if you had to ask someone in medieval times to imagine the future, I think it's highly unlikely they could ever have imagined the industrial times or the world that we have today. It's so far out of the ambit of what you live in. And I think that, to us, is part of the problem we're facing. So we're talking about sustainability, but we have a real lack of imagination to actually think about what kind of world could this be. So we're thinking, actually, we're kind of largely living like we're living now, but things are just a bit better. And so this is really to try to push at this and think, can we actually come up with more radically alternative views of the future? And this kind of approach really also builds on our understanding of complex systems and the way change happens in complex systems. So we know that often radical change, if we look back on big changes that have happened in the past, they often come from small experiments or little seeds that were present in the system, often even for quite long periods of time before the change occurred. So the focus of this project is really to aim to survey a very wide variety of these innovations and experiments that are going on in the world today. And I think we all know about many of these little things that people are trying in order to make a better and more sustainable world. And the idea here is if some of these kinds of innovations were fostered, they could possibly, and this is the important thing, is that they don't just like a seed. It doesn't just become a big version of the small thing. It becomes something completely different. And especially if these innovations combine, they can combine in ways that we can't really predict at all and reinforce each other. And as I mentioned, I think the interesting thing, and this is also one of the things we found in this project, is that people have been very keen to engage because if you, instead of looking for problems, you start looking around you for potential solutions or little innovations that people are trying, you find that they're all around us. And we call these pockets of the future in the present, in the sense of these seeds. But I think importantly, they can also be pockets of the past. So they can be things that have maybe largely kind of systems have changed and things have kind of been eroded from maybe traditional or previous ways of living, but some of those remain. And those can actually also be the source of new innovations that can be used to tackle some of the challenges we face now. Then, as I said, this project is really informed by, I think, quite a fast-growing body of theory on systemic transformations. And this is one of the main pieces of theory also coming out of the Stockholm Resilience Center. And you'll see that in many ways one can also think of these transformations are very similar to regime shifts. They're, in a sense, the same kind of thing. They're about a systemic reorganization, a change in the whole way that the system is functioning. And then I think people have now often been thinking much more about what are the different phases of these transformations, and especially highlighting that often you have this extremely long period of preparation for the transformation, where I think many of these little seeds or innovations are being tested or also being encouraged to experiment with different things. Often it also means that you need to be weakening some of the dominant forces that are currently shaping the system in order to prepare for some kind of change. In many of these big shifts that happen, there's some sort of crisis or window of opportunity or something where some of these innovations can actually be plugged in at a larger scale and then embedded in building a different system. So it's also understanding this kind of process and thinking about how does that work. So, I mean, I always think also even sort of the end of apartheid, I think you can also think a bit about, this kind of dynamic in terms of a long period before change happens. And then, importantly, it's also once change happens, you're not just like, oh, now we've changed. There's a lot of work to do once change has happened, because you also need to, it's a completely new way that the system or the world is functioning, and you need to then set in place a lot of policies and practices that can govern that new condition again. So this looks a little bit scary, but I'll maybe just step through it quickly. This is also a paper that's currently in preparation, thinking about a theory of change, specifically based on this project. As you'll see along the top are these three phases that I showed in the previous slide, and then this is combined with some work out of a Dutch center that really looks at how this works across different scales. So just quickly, essentially, the way we think about it is that there's this emerging awareness and meta-narratives about the need for systemic change, and these in turn are part of what inspires these little seeds or experiments that people are conducting, and that those trials themselves kind of fuel this meta-narrative. So there's a dynamic going on there, and in some ways we could say we're kind of in that phase. What normally then happens is that over time, some of these seeds can kind of start linking together, and you can have what they call the emergence of a proto-regime. So it's sort of a mini alternative system, because many times these seeds are actually just like one part of an alternative way of doing things, but they don't, for instance, like if you have new electric cars, then you've got the car, but now you need, for instance, the places to charge the batteries. And so it's and then you need a whole set of things that happen in the broader system. So you have to link together all these innovations. Then, as I said, often you have some kind of crisis or window of opportunity, and that's really important for moving from these micro, small-scale, local innovations to actually embedding this, for instance, potentially at the level of at least a city or a province or potentially a country, and getting these new ideas embedded in kind of some larger scale policy. And then, as I said, it's not like your work is done then, but then there's a big phase then of how do you kind of consolidate and build this alternative system. And we know from previous examples that at that point, sometimes you manage to institutionalize the new regime, but then it kind of gets gobbled up again by the existing regime. Or it can kind of get just stuck at that meso scale and not really kind of scale up. So that's really sort of the framework we're using also to think about change, at least in this project. And as I said, the main thing we're focusing on then are these little seeds, surveying them, and then thinking about what kind of radically alternative scenarios or future visions could they lead to. We've also done a little bit of thinking on these pathways, but that's really, I think, the next step where we want to do some more thinking. So then, just to sort of show a bit some of the results from this. So we've had this big online campaign collecting these seeds on this website. And if anyone has ideas of potential innovations, please contribute them online. Then, as I mentioned, we've also run a series of dialogues in Southern Africa where we've, I think has also been actually more fun. It's actually engaging with the participants in specific settings to think about these innovations. And so we ran one here in Stellenbosch already in 2014. Then we had one focused on urban systems in Cape Town. And then we've had two in Kenya and Mozambique, linked also to another UK-funded project. So some of the lessons from the dialogues is that, as I say, they're very positive workshops. People are very inspired to think about like hopeful and positive futures. And people are also really interested to think about the future. And I think especially if you're engaging with some policymakers, people I think are often quite swamped by the problems of the present, and they find this actually quite hopeful. And then also that kind of focusing on these stories is also kind of creates a really nice space for sharing different ideas, but also different underlying assumptions. And for instance, we've had some heated debates about some of the seeds and whether what some people think is a good seed is actually a bad seed, etc. But it's sort of trying to uncover what were some of the assumptions embedded in these innovations. And then we had a paper coming out that just looked across all the seeds that have been collected as part of the global project. And then we've obviously got a lot here in Southern Africa because we've been doing extra work here. And then we've coded them all for a bunch of different features and trying to understand how these seeds differ, sort of what kinds of innovations they represent. For instance, are they things that are new innovations, or are they trying to stop problems, or are they simply like really an initial or prototype, or they're already quite long-lasting kind of initiatives? Do they address economic or technological issues, etc.? But then I think the more exciting thing is that is trying to then move from these seeds to these scenarios of alternative futures. And also actually working with a local scenario practitioner here from Somerset West, Tanya Ishrat, we came up with this quite novel new approach to building these global or regional scenarios using these seeds. So most scenario processes start much more top-down, looking at big drivers, and we haven't done that at all. We've kind of started with these innovations. And I think it took quite a lot of piloting and testing to develop this process, but what's nice is now it's been basically the same process has been used in Sweden. It's probably going to be used in Canada, and we've also had it used in this IPB's, the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, also used this approach. So it's really kind of contributed something new to this field. Just briefly, essentially what it goes through a set of steps. This approach, but you start with this future wheel. So in this picture in the middle, you have, for instance, 3 seeds in the pink card, and then you have to think through if this seed was the way the world worked, because the way things were done, what are the first order kind of implications of how things would be different in the world, and then you kind of build out from there iteratively. Then we also use this 3 horizons framework to look at how you would get from the current seeds to this future. This is sort of shown by that yellow trajectory, and then the pink cards kind of show how the dominant system has to decline or change along the way to get to this future. And this is, I think, something we want to explore a little bit more and how we can do more with this. And I think also people were super engaged at this workshop, and then at the final day people had to present their scenario in some way, and I'll let you know that several of these people are professors, came up with this very cool play in the dark, and this was actually one where people no longer die. So it was they were quite science fiction-y. But I think the other interesting thing is that people were really believing in these scenarios by the end of the week, and thinking that not only are they possible, but that they're actually already happening. And I think that is the thing, is because they're building from seeds and things that already exist, you get the sense that they're not impossible, because you're kind of thinking through the ramifications of blowing up things that are already there. But you can get to very strange futures. So that was really fun. At the moment, we're kind of doing a bunch of work now on comparing these scenarios. I think the main thing we're really interested in is exploring sort of the values and assumptions underlying these seeds. So why do people think these are good futures? And especially, where are the points of convergence and divergence? And then also, as I emphasize, where are there really some big differences from the usual sustainability discourse? Because also our sense is we're a bit locked into this new way of thinking about sustainability that maybe is also part of the challenge we're facing. And then I think a big set of questions is then sort of more deeply also considering sort of what is a good Anthropocene, who is defining this good Anthropocene, and who is it good for? And then lastly, you can see we have some philosophers engaged here, is also thinking at a more deep level, does the sort of this condition of the Anthropocene actually imply a new role and responsibility for what it means to be human on the planet? So with that, I'm done, and I'm going to just show a little movie that we put together that I think is quite nice, that shows some of the outcomes from the scenarios.
We live in turbulent times and are surrounded by visions of dark and uncertain futures. Societies are changing, and people are transforming the environment, the entire planet in unexpected ways. In many places, we are increasingly disconnected from nature and from each other. These are key symptoms of a new geological era, which scientists call the Anthropocene. But there is hope. There are seeds of positive futures all around us, seeds of good Anthropocenes. These seeds are projects, organizations, initiatives that are experimenting with doing things differently and making an impact for the better. Better for people and better for our planet. But for now, these seeds are small, local, and not part of the mainstream. What would happen if these seeds were to grow? If they became towering trees with interlocking networks of roots supporting and nourishing each other? What if these seeds became the way we do things, the way the world works? What would the future look like? This is what we asked a group of scientists, artists, and changemakers at a workshop in Cape Town in November 2016. Starting with 4 sets of very different seed projects and initiatives, we asked the participants to imagine what Southern Africa would be like if these seeds were to grow, combine, and become the new normal. We asked them to stretch their imaginations. We asked them to dig deep. As a result, the participants developed 4 radically alternative positive visions for the future. Although these visions differed in their details, they had many striking commonalities. All 4 futures are deeply shaped by technology. This technology is used in a way that enables people to connect to each other, to develop a shared understanding and empathy, rather than become isolated and distrustful. Technological advances also free people up from working just to pay bills. Instead, people work to contribute to their community, live fulfilling lives, and express themselves as human beings. In all 4 futures, power is highly decentralized, and people actively participate in decision-making. Societies are more equal and fair, and value the unique differences between people. Collaboration, rather than competition, is a core ethic. These values extend to humanity's relationship with the environment. Thoughtless exploitation of resources is replaced by responsible stewardship of nature, which is understood to belong to everyone. Most food and other goods are produced locally, minimizing transport and waste. Overconsumption is replaced by flourishing societies in which people respect ecological limits and each other. Idealistic? Yes. Impossibly utopian? No. These are our visions, and the seeds of these futures already exist. Let us nourish them, be inspired to plant more seeds, and let it grow into a beautiful new world.